Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a 2018 horror film called The Nun. Spoiler alert, so watch out and take care. The movie begins in a grim-looking place in Romania. It's the year 1952. Inside the abbey, a young nun named Victoria is walking with an older nun in a dark hallway. The older nun holds a lamp and a key, while Victoria is crying and visibly scared. They reach a wooden door at the end of the hallway, which has a sign that says God ends here. As the older nun opens the door, Victoria asks her if the relic can save them. In response, the older nun looks back and decisively tells Victoria to have faith. After that, the older nun proceeds to enter the door while Victoria, who is in tears, kneels and prays in front of the door. In a few moments, the older nun comes back bloody and hands over the key to Victoria. She warns Victoria not to let the demon take her. Suddenly, something inside the door drags the older nun back, and Victoria screams in fear. In a panic, Victoria runs to a room at the opposite end of the hallway and shuts the door. She grabs a rope and asks God for forgiveness for what she's about to do. Holding the key tightly, she puts the rope around her neck. As she glances back, she sees the demon, Valak, slowly approaching her. Ultimately, she jumps with the rope and hangs herself. At a different time, a young man named Frenchie discovers Victoria's decaying body hanging in the abbey. At the Vatican, important church officials tell Father Burke about Victoria's death. They instruct him to investigate her death because the church considers suicide a serious sin. They also give Father Burke information about the man who discovered Victoria's body and assign a young nun named Irene to assist him. Father Burke goes to a monastery where he meets Irene and explains the church's orders to her. In the next scene, Father Burke and Irene go to Frenchie's house. They meet Frenchie, who comes across as flirtatious. When he sees Irene, Frenchie introduces himself by kissing her hand. However, Father Burke introduces himself as a priest and Irene as a nun. Upon realizing that Irene is a nun, Frenchie apologizes to her. Then Father Burke asks Frenchie to take them to the abbey. However, Frenchie seems reluctant to go there. Then Irene personally asks him to take them there. This makes him smile, and he immediately accepts their request. In the end, he takes them to the abbey, and they arrive there. Father Burke asks Frenchie about the location of Victoria's body. Frenchie guides him to the ice house. In the ice house, they witness Victoria's body sitting. Father Burke examines the body and finds a key in her hand. After that, they proceed to give the body a proper burial outside. After the burial, the three of them enter the abbey. They see that Victoria's blood is still there at the front of the abbey. As they walk past a chair, Irene notices a dark figure behind the chair and she talks to it. It turns out to be the abbess. Then Father Burke sincerely talks to the abbess about Victoria's death. However, the abbess tells them to come back tomorrow to find answers, as there will be silence in the abbey. Additionally, the abbess tells them to stay for a while in a lodging area at the convent. After that, Father Burke and Irene proceed to stay in the lodging area at the convent. Meanwhile, Frenchie heads back home and passes through the forest. In the forest, he encounters a ghost nun who appears to be Victoria. Intrigued, Frenchie decides to trail the ghostly figure, but as he pursues it, the spectral nun vanishes into thin air. Suddenly, without warning, the ghostly nun reappears, descending right before Frenchie, sending him into a state of shock that causes him to stumble and collapse to the ground. However, fortune favors him as the apparition dissipates, granting him a chance to evade its clutches. Seizing the opportunity, Frenchie swiftly gathers Irene and together they flee back to the sanctuary of the convent. Irene reveals to Father Burke that she had several visions in the past. She adds that the thought Mary points that way remains in her during those visions. Father Burke shares with her that he also had a boy named Daniel who had visions in the past. He performed an exorcism on Daniel and was able to cast out the demon that possessed him. However, Daniel was severely wounded by the exorcism and died a few days later. Father Burke still feels guilty about the incident and shares the story with Irene. Late at night, while everyone was sleeping peacefully in the convent, a radio suddenly starts playing music out of nowhere. The noise wakes up Father Burke, who was resting in his own room. Surprised and curious, Father Burke decides to step outside and find out where the music is coming from. He shines his flashlight towards the radio, but just as he does, the music stops abruptly, as if someone turned it off. Worried about Irene's safety, Father Burke goes to check on her in her room. However, as he looks after her, he notices a young boy running towards another door. Intrigued and determined, Father Burke chases after the boy into the dark outside. As he follows the boy, Father Burke recognizes the boy as the ghost of Daniel. This makes him more eager to follow the boy until they reach the graveyard outside. Father Burke catches up to the boy, but suddenly a snake emerges from the boy and attacks Father Burke. Frantically attempting to escape, he falls into a grave with a bell. In an instant, a demonic force closes the grave. Meanwhile, Irene is alone in the convent, walking with a lamp. She finds a group of nuns who appear to be having a ceremony. In front of the ceremony, there is a beheaded statue of Christ. At the same time, a shadow of a nun moves around the wall of the convent. She follows the shadow, and suddenly the group of nuns disappears. As Irene looks back, the creepy face of Valak appears in front of her. After that, she goes to the graveyard to find Father Burke. She is able to locate his grave immediately and gets a shovel to dig it up. In the end, she is able to save Father Burke from the grave. The following day, Father Burke and Irene go to the abbey. However, only Irene enters the abbey, and Father Burke is left at the entrance. Inside the abbey, Sister Ona meets Irene. She shares with Irene the history of the abbey and reveals that the abbey was built by a duke during the Middle Ages. The duke built the abbey to open a portal from hell, which allowed an evil creature to walk on earth. The Catholics arrived at the abbey to stop the duke, and they successfully sealed the portal using a relic with the blood of Jesus. After that, the Catholics occupied the abbey to perform perpetual prayer to prevent evil from coming out of the portal. Unfortunately, during World War II, the abbey was bombed, which opened the portal again. After sharing the history of the abbey, Sister Ona emotionally tells Irene about the creepy nun that appears in the abbey. She believes that the creepy nun made Victoria commit suicide. Suddenly, Sister Ona tells Irene that it's time to leave the abbey, but the gate is already closed. This makes Sister Ona decide to have Irene stay in a room in the abbey. Meanwhile, at the entrance of the abbey, the abbess tells Father Burke that Irene is lost. Then the abbess lies down, making her appear unconscious. Father Burke opens up the veil, but as he does so, the demonic hands of Valak grab him. He breaks free from the hands and the abbess disappears. Back inside the abbey, Irene wakes up from a creepy dream. As she wakes up, a nun is praying in front of her. Suddenly, the nun disappears, and Valak appears behind her. Irene hears the voice of someone somewhere, so she goes outside the room to follow the voice. In a few moments, she arrives at a wooden door that says God ends here. Then she witnesses Valak emerge from the wooden door. The ugly face of Valak terrifies her, and Valak attacks her, trying to get the key. However, she is able to hold onto the key and escape into the hallway. As she runs away from Valak, a hand instantly grabs her. It is Ona who grabs her and tells her to go to the chapel to pray with the other nuns. As Irene arrives at the chapel inside the abbey, she witnesses a nun praying eagerly and a dead body covered with cloth. She proceeds to remove the cloth, revealing the dead body of Ona holding a cross. After that, a group of nuns arrives and starts to pray solemnly. This makes Irene follow them and start praying. Suddenly, a demonic force makes the nuns fly away from her and beheads the statue of Christ. The demonic force terrifies her, but she holds onto her faith and continues to pray. While praying, the demonic force continues to attack. After a short while, they both make their way to the chapel, and suddenly, the evil force vanishes. Irene then shares with them about the group of nuns who were praying together. However, when they look again, the group of nuns has disappeared. It turns out that Irene was the only one who saw them, as if it was just a vision. This realization hits them hard, as they come to understand that they have been all alone in the abbey this whole time. They decide to investigate further and examine the dead body. They soon discover that Victoria was the last nun remaining in the abbey. They also realize that Valak, the evil entity, needs a soul to be able to roam outside of the abbey. This revelation leads them to understand that Victoria didn't take her own life, she sacrificed herself to protect others from being possessed by Valak. In the end, they find the answers they were seeking. The abbey is no longer a holy place, evident from the disturbing images they've witnessed before, the inverted cross, the statue of Christ with its head removed, and the sight of Victoria's blood at the front of the abbey. Particularly, the presence of Victoria's blood symbolizes the end of the perpetual prayer in the abbey. In the next scene, the three of them proceed to the relic place in order to find the relic that can close the portal. However, they cannot find the relic there. Meanwhile, Father Burke notices that the hands of Mary's statue are pointing in a certain direction. This made him recall Irene's visions. Mary points that way. After that, they use Victoria's key to open the place where the relic is. When they open it, they are amazed by what they found. Father Burke takes the relic and gives it to Irene. They continue towards a wooden door with the words "God ends here" written on it. Father Burke opens the door and enters immediately, with Irene and Frenchie following closely behind. Irene reminds them that their goal is to locate the portal. After that, they decide to split up and search for the portal individually, despite the potential danger of encountering a demon. This choice adds suspense to the scene. As they navigate the hallways, Irene enters a room and accidentally steps on a demonic symbol. The symbol slowly lights up, causing her to scream in fear. She tries to escape, but finds herself facing a group of demonic nuns with hidden faces. Meanwhile, Frenchie tries to find Irene and realizes that she is in a room behind a door. As he opens the door, he witnesses a group of demonic nuns with hidden faces. This terrifies him, and he decides to leave the room. However, he hears Irene's voice asking for help, which makes him go back, despite being in tears and terrified. He finds Irene surrounded by the demonic nuns, but after a few moments, the nuns walk away, revealing Irene in an unusual posture. Frenchie cautiously removes the cloth covering Irene's face and realizes that she has been possessed by Valak. Valak attacks Frenchie and insults him by calling him a Frenchman. In response, Frenchie humorously corrects Valak by stating that he is French-Canadian, not French. Quickly, Frenchie uses the relic to wipe the blood of Christ onto Irene's face, which immediately removes Valak's influence. Valak chokes Frenchie until he loses consciousness. Meanwhile, Valak screams at Irene, causing her to be propelled into a water pool. Father Burke rushes towards Irene in the hallway, but is attacked by a snake controlled by the demonic Daniel. He manages to grab the snake, escape its grip, and then rushes to Irene at the water pool. Meanwhile, the ugly face of Valak slowly emerges from the water. This makes Irene tremble in fear, and then Valak drowns her in the water. In response, Father Burke performs a prayer to fight Valak. However, Valak screams back at him, sending him flying through the air. Meanwhile, Irene puts the blood of Christ from the relic in her mouth. Then, as Valak holds her up, she spits blood onto the ugly face of Valak. The blood of Christ burns Valak's face, making it even more disfigured. Finally, the portal successfully pulls Valak away. Meanwhile, Irene is left drowning underwater. Frenchie arrives to save her, and she is unconscious as he drags her from the water. Frenchie arrives just in time to rescue her and pulls her out of the water. Irene is unconscious, so Frenchie performs mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to revive her. Eventually, Irene regains consciousness, and Frenchie apologizes for the intense rescue kiss, explaining that it was necessary to save her life and had no romantic intent. Irene thanks him for saving her life. In the next scene, Father Burke, Irene, and Frenchie are about to leave the abbey. As they are about to leave, Frenchie notices an inverted cross mark on his nape. In the end, they proceed to leave the abbey. The movie ends in a lecture room 20 years later. In the lecture, the teacher shows footage of an exorcism case. In the footage, Frenchie appears to be possessed by Valak. Interestingly, Lorraine, the main character from the Conjuring films, is seen alongside Frenchie in the footage. This connection between a possessed Frenchie and Lorraine suggests a link between this film and the Conjuring films. Furthermore, Valak is the demon that haunts Lorraine in the Conjuring films. This implies that this film provides the backstory of Valak and explains how it eventually affects Lorraine and her family. As it turns out, Valak is able to possess Frenchie during their encounter in the abbey. The inverted cross mark on Frenchie's neck is not a coincidence, it signifies that he has been taken over by Valak. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video.